Hello everyone. Initially, the goal of today's video was to provide useful tips to whoever is currently trying or would want to try a solo challenge. So for those who don't know, by solo challenge, I mean playing the game with what is probably the hardest rule set ever, playing without heroes, henchmen, and other players. But I figured out this video could actually be useful for anyone willing to improve or to understand some rather complex game mechanics. This video is purely didactic, educational, and thus clearly different from what I usually do. And my wish is that it's still gonna be both enjoyable and useful for you. Please keep in mind though that most things I explain in this video might be superfluous or overwhelming if you just started playing Guild Wars, and it would be completely normal and not a problem since they are not required at all to complete the game the traditional way. I've sorted the video as a series of tips, so there are about 40 tips. Just to give a brief overview, I'm gonna give general but I think useful recommendations, go deep into NPC behavior and skill usage, give tips on how to prepare your combat and what you can do to increase your chances in combat, especially as a solo player. I'm also going to share almost all what I know about aggro and leash range, two things that can be confusing and for which it's very hard to find deep explanations, in my opinion, even on the official wiki. And the last part will focus on how to break enemies' AI, and I'll finish with short miscellaneous tips. Okay, so let's start with the first series of tips that apply before even starting anything. Be prepared. I cannot emphasize enough how important this part is. A lot of things I'm gonna say might be trivial, but I'm gonna say it anyway. So tip number one, know as many skills as possible. Their cooldown, how much damage they deal, if they can be dodged or not, what type of skill they are. This is important both to know if enemies are dangerous and to create a build that is appropriate for the challenge you're gonna go for. And this is linked with tip number two, know the build the enemies you're gonna meet use. Again, this is trivial but so important. You don't want to bring a build based on enchantments if most enemies are gonna remove your enchantments all the time. You don't want to base your damage on poison and bleed if your enemies are not fleshy. You want to be able to kill all the enemies you need to kill at the very least in 1v1. It is also important to know if you can prevent some damage by hiding behind walls and if your own damage requires you to see the enemies. Associated with this tip, it is nice if you know what type of damage your enemies deal so that you can choose the best gear and skills available. If needed, here is a table I did with the different types of damage, what type of enemies usually deal these types of damage, and some gears or skills to reduce them. Just note that armor ignoring damage are not included. Tip number three, know the problem solver skills. There are many ways to deal with a group of enemies, but some skills are so powerful that having them in your build open up many possibilities and make things way easier. We sometimes talk about problem solver skills, and here are some of them. Skills that disable enemy skills like diversion, D-shot, and D-shop are very strong. Any skill that causes health degen, like Hunter's Shot or like Siphon, can be a huge help when enemies don't have a healer. Having allies like spirits or pets can be game changer, of course, because of how strong they are. And there are some other skills that I'm not gonna talk too much about that can really help a lot. Also, I need to mention PV only skills if you allow them, because some of them are just so overpowered that they can solve many issues very easily, Snipe being the most obvious one. Okay, tip number four, know or investigate how the AI use skills. Because you might think some skills are problematic, but they actually aren't because the NPCs don't use them as a player would. Here are some very generic rules that will already cover many skills. NPCs in the same group do not use the same skill at the same time. For example, if you go against frozen elementals, you are gonna see that they don't use water tridents at the same time, even though they could spike with the skill. NPCs do not cast a hex on a target that is already affected by the same hex. NPCs do not use enchantment removal skill if there is no enchantment to remove. NPCs do not cast an enchantment on a target that is already affected by the same enchantment. They do not heal, remove conditions, or remove X's if they do not need to. They do not spare energy, and they drop ashes to attack. You can test all of this if you want. It will be true 99.9% of the time. But there are also many skill-specific hidden rules, and the fact that an NPC will cast a skill or not can depend on many things. Skill you have equipped, the presence of allies or enemies nearby the target, the distance from the target, profession, weapon equipped, energy, HP, if the target is attacking, moving, knockdown, or whatnot, presence of conditions, hexes, enchantments. And these rules can be different depending on the campaign you are in or whether you are in normal or hard mode. I added some skills as examples here. And this, of course, is important because if you know the rules, you can manipulate enemy skill usage. I'm going to give you a few examples on how this can be useful. Look at this boss who is using Ether Fist only if my energy is above 50%. This means that if I keep my energy below 50%, he's not gonna heal and is the same as if he didn't have the skill. Or look at these mesmers who don't use Chaos Storm unless I swap to my wand set. These cases are everywhere, and the more you know about them, the more you can predict what's gonna happen and choose the best way to adapt to a problematic situation. Okay, tip number 5, beware of bosses. Of course, you should know that bosses are not normal enemies and have some particularities. They usually have a natural health regen. Prophecy's bosses often move faster. Some bosses have natural resistance, which cut the duration of hexes and conditions by half. Some of them deal twice damage and cast twice faster, so they are harder to interrupt, for example. This table gives you an overview of bosses' characteristics depending on where they are, although there are some exceptions, of course. Tip number 6, think about the triggers. The fact that an ally turns into an enemy or an NPC you need to protect, the fact that a quest gets updated, the fact that a mission is failed or completed, the fact that a group of enemy changes behavior, the fact that a gate is opened, and so on and so on. Most of the time, these things happen because something happened before. This can be you or an NPC crossing a trigger on the ground, an enemy or an ally who dies, or you talking to an NPC or interacting with an item. Of course, I can't detail all the situations you are going to face, but here is the tip. If ever you struggle doing something, think about the triggers. Maybe triggering something later or even not triggering them is the key. It is, for example, the best way to deal with Grand Court of Zebelke solo. And let's now move to tips that apply during the combat. And I'm gonna start by redefining a basic mechanic of the game, Aggro. Here is your character. On your compass, you can see that there is a circular virtual bubble around your character. This bubble is called the Aggro bubble, or the danger zone. Only your own Aggro bubble is visible, but there is one around any character and any NPC, including spirits and minions. It does not change over time, it's the same size for almost all the creators in the game. Per Guild Wars Wiki, Aggro is the mechanic of whether an enemy is aware of your presence. And that's the purpose of the Aggro bubble. It gives you an idea of how close two creators can get before being aware of each other's presence. When you enter the aggro bubble of an enemy, which 99% of the time is equal to this enemy being inside your own aggro bubble, this enemy is aware that you exist, unless it is a very low level enemy in starter zone or a spirit that does not attack. And when an enemy is aware that you are here, his whole group is as well. And at this point, the only ways to make them forget about you or to break aggro are to create a big enough gap between you and the enemy group to die, or to leave the enemy group's leash range. But I'm gonna talk about that later. So related to the aggro comes the tip number 7, choose the way you want to gain aggro. There are many ways to gain aggro. Entering the enemy's aggro bubble, attacking the enemy, or successfully using a skill on the enemy. And we can also mention that if you are damaged by an enemy, for example by a trap, a spirit, or minion, you also gain aggro. And the same if you damage an enemy or one of its summon creator. There is no best way to gain aggro, and you should choose the way you want to gain aggro depending on the situation. As an overall view, here is an estimation on how often I use each of them in solo gameplay. Tip number 8 is also related to aggro. If you want to gain aggro by attacking, consider using a staff or a wand instead of a bow. Despite what's written on the wiki right at the time I released this video, and despite what a lot of veteran players are gonna tell you, using a bow is not always the best way to gain aggro with an attack. Why? Because the height difference influences the range of bows a lot. So here is an example of a situation in which you would want to pull with a wand or a staff and not with a bow. Look at what happens if I use my bow to pull. I'm forced to enter the aggro bubble before even being able to shoot an arrow. Using a wand or a staff there is thus way better because the range is not affected by the height difference. So keep that in mind. Another tip related to pulling, which is tip number 9, avoid letting your character place automatically to pull. You'll shoot casts from further if you manually define from where you want to shoot or cast. The best way to illustrate that is to show you. On this first example, I press space and let my character automatically go and attack. On this second example, I instead place myself at max attack range, and you see that I attack from further compared to before. This is the same for any weapon and is also true for skill usage. It might seem anecdotal, but the small difference in distance sometimes is crucial. Also note that if you pull with an attack, you have some time to run away before the projectile hit the target. If you use a skill, it's the opposite. The enemy has some time to get to you while you are under the effect of Aftercast, and I'm gonna talk about Aftercast a bit later. Tip number 10, when you retreat, choose wisely between moving in a straight line or dodging projectiles. You are faster when you go straight, which limits the damage melees deal to you and the number of spell enemies can cast on you. But if the enemies chasing you have many projectiles, it might be better to dodge than running straight. Tip number 11, beware of corpse aggro. You should keep in mind that corpses still have their aggro bubble until they disappear, 45 seconds after the NPC died. This is also true for NPCs that do not leave an exploitable or even visible corpse, for example, djinns or ghosts. Their aggro bubble is removed 45 seconds after death. There are 3 exceptions, minion and spirits. They immediately lose their aggro bubble when they die. Bosses, they keep their aggro bubble forever, even dead. And other NPCs for which the corpse never disappears. For example, NPCs that auto-raise after a few minutes, or some corpses that are already there when you enter the map. Anyway, the fact that a corpse still has an aggro bubble means that something called corpse aggro exists. And if you want to avoid aggroing a group after you broke aggro, you should wait for the corpse to disappear or circumvent it. It also can be exploited. For example, you can gain aggro of a group by entering back the aggro bubble of one of their party members' corpse. Tip number 12, movement speed is important, and for many, many reasons. An enemy won't follow you if you are faster, he will instead run to the center of its leash range. This means that if you pull and then run faster than the enemy, you are gonna struggle to pull it away. You can also use this to make the enemies from the same group ball together. And you can use this to split some groups. For example, in behemoth groups, the necros are faster than the dervishes, so you can be at a movement speed at which the necros will follow you, but the dervishes won't, giving you some time to deal with the necros in 1v1 before the dervishes get there. Just note that movement speed is not enough to break aggro. It will help to create a gap between you and the enemies, but if the gap is not big enough, you won't break aggro, even if you are faster than enemies. Tip number 13, Aftercast is important. Aftercast delay is the period after successfully activating certain skills, during which the skill user cannot move or activate any other skill with Aftercast. It lasts for about 3/4 seconds. It is important, for example, that you know you won't be able to use an interrupt after having cast another skill, which is one of the main reasons why some people struggle interrupting. But you can turn that into an advantage. For example, if you cast a spell while an enemy is activating or finishing to activate another spell, he most likely won't be able to interrupt you because of aftercast delay. And also, if you want to interrupt a very quick spell that you know the enemy queued up, you can mentally count for 3/4 seconds and use your skill to interrupt your enemy right after the aftercast delay. Okay, tip number 14. Imagine if you could immediately gain 30 energy to finish off a fight, have more armor to avoid being one-shot, or gain 60 HP instead of dying due to a health degen. Well, you can already do all of that, and you just need to have the appropriate weapon sets for that. And swapping weapon is actually gonna help you a lot, so get used to it if you are not. Also, reminder that having some weapons equipped instead of others influence the way enemies use their skills. So that's also something you should take into consideration. The next level is to swap headpiece before casting some skills. That's something I've been doing lately and that can change the result of a fight if you do it properly. In my case, I think I would not have been able to kill Kanakzai without swapping a headpiece. Tip number 15, use the terrain. Using the walls and trees to obstruct the projectiles is a key technique, whatever you do in the game. Most bridges can also be used as LOS spots, as you can see here. Also, if you can, place higher than the enemies to reduce the damage from ranged attacks and increase your own attack's damage. For the next part, I need to talk to you about what the leash range is. Leash range is a circular area around an enemy. All enemies in a same group have the same leash range. While you are inside their leash range, enemies will fight with you as long as they are aggroed. When you are outside of the leash, beyond the leash range, enemies will eventually break aggro and go back to their original position. Now, this was a very simplified overview because you are going to see that it is not that easy and that there are many exceptions and weird behaviors that I'm going to try to review. Just to insist a little bit more, aggro bubble and leash range are not the same. Aggro bubble answers the question, how close do you need to be for the enemies to notice you? While the leash range answers the question, how far will enemies chase? They are both circular, but the aggro bubble is visible on your compass, while the leash range is not. Also, as I just said, each enemy has its own aggro bubble, while the leash range is the same for enemies in the same group. Since the enemy behavior is not the same depending if they are inside or outside the leash range, what's the most important is to be able to estimate the size of the leash range. And that's my next advice. Estimate how big the leash range is before aggroing. Indeed, this allows you to know up to where you can pull an enemy group. Also, in case something bad happens, you are gonna want to know how far you need to go to break aggro. For example, so that you know if you can get to safety without getting trapped by another group of enemies. So here is a pretty accurate rule for you to estimate the size of the leash range of a group of enemies. You should distinguish enemies that are completely stationary from enemies that stay in the same area and from enemies that are patrolling. Stationary enemies have a short and fixed leash range, with a radius which is about the same as an aggro bubble. Enemies that move in random directions and stay in the same area have a fixed and quite big leash range, the radius being about 1 compass big. But note that some of these groups have a regrouping behavior, and that during this small period, their leash range is smaller. This is what we usually call bad aggro. Patrolling enemies, which are recognizable because they all move towards the same direction, have a big aggro range as well. That follows one enemy that is called the group leader. We are going to talk about that later. However, note that patrolling enemies can temporarily adopt another configuration, and in this case, their leash range might or might not adapt to this new configuration, which is why patrols are the hardest when it comes to leash range estimation. Note that there are of course some rare exceptions. For example, these enemies have a big leash range despite being initially stationary. Also note that rangers who have their pets dead, enemies from the Mystery of Purity, and some worms have infinite leash range. They can follow you through the whole map. Okay, now that you know how to estimate the size of the leash range of a group, let's see what it can be useful for. So here is tip number 17. If needed, use the leash range to split an enemy party. I'm gonna show you examples. Here is a group of Hecates. You can see that they are randomly moving, their leash range is therefore quite big. When I bring them to the edge of the leash range and go beyond the leash range, they stop following me and get back to their original location. But if I continuously enter and leave the leash range while the aggro is on me, enemy team is gonna end up being split. And this has many uses. It means that I can, for example, kill the melees while they are moving. They never hit me and their casters are too far away to cast on me or heal the melee. It can even go beyond this. All enemies can temporarily overextend, meaning going beyond their leash range. And this can be exploited a lot. With casters, for example, a caster that overextended is still gonna prioritize offensive spell or signet usage over getting back inside their leash. You can see it on this example. I am outside of the leash range. You can see the party members leaving, but he's still using offensive spells and is gonna do it as long as he has offensive spells not on cooldown and enough energy to cast. And I can kill him while he's in this situation. With melees, it's even easier. They tend to overextend if you let them hit you a bit, meaning it's even easier to split them from the rest of the party. And last but not least, enemies with touch skills or half cast range spells can go way beyond their leash range to use a touch skill on you. Sometimes you can even pull them half of the map away from their leash range, as you can see with this assassin boss. Also, overall, note that faster enemies are easier to make overextend than slower enemies. All of this is way harder to do with a stationary group or with a bad aggro. As you can see there, they don't follow as much. Note that bad aggro can still be useful if you don't have much room to move, for example. Okay, so let's now get back to the patrols because there is something important I didn't talk about yet. Patrol's leash range can be relocated at will, as much as possible and as far as you want. Let me explain. Here is a patrolling group, the leash range is moving with them, and as I said, the center of the leash range is determined by the position of the group leader. As soon as I aggro this group, the leash range is settled. That's very important. Otherwise, the leash range would be following me with these enemies, and these enemies would follow me forever. So the leash range is settled once aggroed, and if I go beyond the leash range, enemies will stop following me, will turn back, and if I don't immediately enter the leash range again, they will break aggro and start patrolling again after a few seconds. With enemies that patrol quite slowly, it's easy to notice they will move slowly again when they are back to patrolling. Anyway, once I broke aggro, the group leader becomes again the center of the leash range. And since the enemies are not at the same place as when I initially aggroed them, the leash range also is at a different place. Meaning that if I aggro again fast enough, I can drag the enemies further than initially. And by doing this over and over, I can pull them wherever I want. I could, for example, pull a patrol of rangers up to a rock that I want to use as an LOS spot. I can pull them on a group of enemies or allies that I know they will fight each other. It's even useful in factions when you want to gate glitch from Bugdeck Byway to Xakong Skyway to skip a big chunk of the campaign. Anyway, keep in mind that this has many applications, but you can only relocate the leash range of patrols. With another configuration, the leash range does not move. Alright, since I just talked about gate glitching, I felt like I had to talk about it as well. What we mean by gate glitching is passing through a closed gate by using a melee enemy. Only some gates can be glitched through, and if you can't get close enough from the gate or the gate is thick, it usually means that gate glitching won't work. Gate glitching is useful to skip some difficult areas. In solo gameplay, it's especially famous because it is part of the strat used in Thunderhead Keep. So how do you properly gate glitch? The idea is to bring a melee to the gate. It can be an enemy found on the map, but it can also be a minion that you can summon and immediately turn hostile by using Aura of the Leech just before Verata's aura ends on you. Then the idea is to have both you and the enemy close from the door, and to collide with the enemy's collision box towards the door. The collision box will push you towards and through the gate. To give you some more tips, avoid the parts of the gates labeled in red, the middle and especially the corner, because you don't want to get stuck in the corner. When you approach the gate with the enemy on you, approach from one side to drag the enemy close enough from the gate. And when you are well placed, push towards the enemy in between the gate and the enemy and step away from the gates to make sure you went through, because it might just be a visual bug. You can train pretty easily in Boreas seabed mission, for example. Try to glitch through the gates, getting you out of the arena. Now we are gonna enter a new section, which is how to break enemies' AI. These are some techniques I think you should use as a last resort, as they are extremely powerful, but kind of break the game at the same time. So one of the most effective way to break enemy AI is to glitch them far away from the center of their leash range. And then either to be outside of their leash range while they are inside, or even better, be outside of their leash range while they are as well. So how can you do to glitch enemies far away from the center of their leash range? First thing you can do is use the terrain. Enemies will usually try to get back to the center of their leash range, taking the shortest path possible. So if the terrain is zigzaggy enough, or there is a big enough or well-placed obstacle like a mountain, a wall, or whatnot, it is possible that they get stuck on it when trying to get back to their leash range. They kind of forget how to get back home. The further you pull them away from the center of their leash, and the sharper the angles are, the more likely is that the enemies get stuck. And in this situation, if you place yourself outside of their leash, you can cast on them, and while they are still going to be using skills besides attack skills, they are not going to be moving nor attacking. You can even place so that you can use your spells on one of them and the others are out of cast range. Or you can kill them with a flat bow or longbow, with them having for only options to use defensive skills. Or you can have only one of them stuck on the obstacle and the others getting back inside the leash range, which is huge if they have healers, for example. Even some NPCs can be used to glitch enemies. Just note that if you are too close from them, about half your aggro radius, they are very likely gonna try to use their touch skill on you despite you being outside of the leash range. Now you don't even always need a very sharp terrain to glitch the enemies. You can also use your own body as a way to glitch enemies outside of their leash range. Unless you have a TP skill, this will only work on melee enemies. The procedure is quite simple. Drag an enemy outside of the leash range alongside a wall. Then circumvent this enemy and place yourself in between the enemy and the center of their leash range, so that the enemy is body blocked. In this case, this enemy will be unable to get back inside the leash, and it's exactly the same case as if they were stuck on a rock. This is quite hard to pull off at the beginning, but it's a very effective way to deal with melees. Using skills to knock down, snare, or increase your movement speed can make things easier. Just remember that enemies will still be using heals, stances, and spells, including flash enchantment spells. Just a small parenthesis on glitch to precise that the situation is a bit special with patrolling groups. Since the center of their leash range is where the group leader was when you aggroed, you can end up in different situations. If all the enemies are glitched together and you break aggro, the leash range is relocated to where the group leader is, and you'll be inside the leash range again, meaning that the technique won't work, even if the enemies don't know how to get back to their patrolling routes anymore. If the group leader is glitched and other enemies went away, the group leader is gonna fight back since you are inside the leash range. For the rest of the group, they are gonna try to get to the group leader unless they get stuck, which usually happens. And last possible scenario, the group leader is not glitched. In this case, the enemies that are glitched can be safely killed and will behave as normal glitched enemies. They won't attack nor move as long as you are outside of the leash range. And the group leader is not gonna come to help since they are outside the leash range. So, to make the long story short, against a patrolling group, the best way to try to abuse the glitch is to split the group and kill the enemies that are not with the group leader. Also note that I don't think there is any other way to identify the group leader than testing the leash range of the group. Another way to glitch an enemy is to use AoE. You have probably heard that skills dealing AoE damage are bad because they make the enemy scatter. Well, not only it's not always true, but it can be very useful. If the spell dealing damage is a dot type AoE, like Firestorm or Chaos Storm, scatter usually happens only when the enemy is below 50% HP. So using an AoE spell on a full HP enemy is not always a bad idea. Also, as for glitching, an enemy that is trying to scatter is gonna have for priority to leave the AoE. Meaning that if you can both maintain the AoE and body block the enemy in a corner, they are not gonna do anything anymore below 50% HP. So this can be very useful. Alright, now the last way to kind of break enemies' AI is to use right angles. This only works on melees and is something well known by people doing SC. If you have a right angle, you can place yourself in a way that melee enemies will not know how to reach you. Can be very helpful in some situations as well. Alright, you hopefully learned many things already. Now it's time to give shorter tips that didn't really belong to any category but can also be very useful. So tips number 24, some enemies, especially in factions, attack with the longbow range, even though they are not rangers, which means that you can be safe from their spells just by staying far enough from them. Here is a list of most enemies with this behavior. This can be exploited in many ways. For example, if the healer is at longbow range, you can kill the melee without the healer being able to heal them. You can place at the cast range of only one of the enemies while the others attack at longbow range. You can fight an enemy with your bow instead of getting cast on. You can use a spell on an enemy, then retreat outside of cast range. And so on and so on. Very useful. Tips number 25 is about dodging. Dodging is something that can really help him to mitigate damage. All projectiles can be dodged. A good way to estimate how comfortable with dodging you are is to go against the doppelganger in Augury Walk with a wand and no skills in hard mode, and try to survive. The next level is to be able to kill him. Anyway, in my opinion, the best way to dodge attacks is to focus on the enemy you need to dodge. You should change direction as soon as the projectile is fired. Not too early, not too late. Learning the attack animation of enemies can help for that, especially against some enemies with weird animation. Tips number 26. When you know that an enemy ranger has erupted, be ready to cancel your own action to avoid being interrupted. This is, in my opinion, only worth it for Rangers and Paragons interrupts, since you don't have time to cancel skills that would be interrupted by a Mesmer, for example. Tip number 27 is about traps. So traps can be deadly, you all know that because of the amphas. Of course, you can wait for 90 seconds for the trap to disappear, but you can also exploit the fact that there is a small delay before the trap gets triggered by, for example, using a fast IMS like dash to quickly leave the trap, or enter the trap and turn back to leave it immediately. Tips number 28, you'll sometimes encounter NPCs that are neither allies nor enemies. Think, for example, of Luxon Priest if you have more cursing than Luxon points. You may have noticed that they can heal both you or the enemies. If you want to be healed but not the enemies, my advice is to approach them being already damaged instead of the opposite. Tip number 29, there is no Z-axis in Guild Wars. This means that enemies that would be below a bridge can attack you at melee range even if you are on the bridge, and vice versa. To avoid this kind of behavior, you can attack the melees from a safe spot. Be aware though that if you deal damage to enemies who don't know how to reach you, these enemies very often run away after a few seconds. Tips number 30, a few enemies can attack both at melee and distance. This is the case, for example, of the Ghostly Hero or the facets in Dragon Slayer. Keep that in mind because sometimes they deal less damage at melee than at distance, so you might want to go melee even if you are a caster. Tips number 31, in zones where enemies spawn, it often is possible to make them spawn one by one. My advice is then, if you know you are likely gonna encounter spawning enemies, approach from the dangerous area making baby steps and stop moving or turn back as soon as one of them spawns. Tips number 32, sometimes enemies have the wrong weapon equipped or even no weapon. For example, some warriors have shield bash but don't wear any shield. Some enemies have sword attacks and attributes but wield an axe. Notice them because they might be easier than you think. Tips number 33, NPCs AI is gonna get disabled at some point if you are outside of compass range. This is, for example, exploited when you send your heroes cap the god status in Gate of Madness or defend the villagers in Divinity Coast. But it can also be useful or problematic when you play solo. For example, when a necro has many minions and someone is keeping them alive, you can just leave compass range and wait 2 minutes until they are dead. Tip number 34, use the cast range to prevent a healing. It has, for example, been helpful recently on my warrior. I was struggling killing a necro because it was getting healed by the monk boss, so I placed in between the monk and the necro so that they can both attack me, but the necro is out of cast range of the monk. In this case, the monk is gonna prioritize attacking me. This means that I can kill the necro without having the monk healing it. This can also be useful when you have an LOS spot or when you fight as a melee, for example, to have some enemies LOS and one of them at melee range. Tips number 35, think about refreshing a zone. There are quite a lot of groups with random composition or random position. Sometimes instead of smashing your head on a group, the best way is to just refresh until you get a better party composition or a better spawn. Tips number 36, enemies can only raise each other while their corpse is available. So if you wait for a corpse to disappear, it prevents the raise from happening. Very useful in Nightfall, of course, War in Krita and Winds of Change. Tips number 37, created enemies do not belong to the same party. Think, for example, about Torment creators. When they duplicate, the new enemy is a new party, which means that they have a new leash range as well, and they can be split from the initial group. Same with Titans, spawning new Titans in Prophecies. Tips number 38, some enemies have what we call a Dreamy Behaviour. This only happens in hard mode. Enemies with a Dreamy Behaviour will not attack, will follow you despite you being faster than they are, tend to overextend, and will run from you if you chase them. Only casters and paragons can have Dreamy Behaviour, and it doesn't happen with all enemies. This can be useful when you want to split some groups. There are ways to break the Dreamy Behaviour, for example, having the enemy to run out of energy. And last but not least, tips number 39, enemies will heal less and less over time. This is something we still don't fully understand, but in many cases, the more an enemy will use a healing skill, the less it will be effective. You can see this happening here, for example, with Healing Signet. At some point, this enemy will only heal for 1 HP with Healing Signet. Note that the diminished healing effect will remain even if you break aggro and apparently does not affect all types of healing. But that's something we are still unsure about. Anyway, it's extremely powerful because it means that as soon as you can survive an enemy, you don't need extremely high damage to eventually kill it. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned many things. Again, all of this will most likely not be useful if you don't play solo, but it can help understanding what happens sometimes or deal with hard situations. At some point, you might end up entering a zone and having many things running into your head. These guys are a patrol, so I can extend their leash range. This guy attacks us at longbow range. These are some LOS spots. This guy won't use obsidian flesh if he's not damaged, and so on, and so on, and so on. I'm sure I forgot to talk about some things, but I think the video is already quite complete. I did my best to explain things clearly, but if ever there are some things that you did not understand, feel free to reach out in the comments in-game or on Twitch, and I will happily try to explain again. Also, to end this video, I'll just add some words about solo gameplay. Playing the game solo is not how the game is supposed to be played. You are supposed to play either with other players or NPCs that help you through your adventure. But when you play solo, you'll encounter very stimulating situations because you'll need to survive and kill the enemies on your own. And let's be honest, this is highly challenging. That's what we soloers like about it. And it is so rewarding to complete a quest or mission. The feeling simply has no match. We have a Discord and a wiki that can help you if ever you are stuck. But for solo, as for anything you do in the game, the most important thing is that you have fun. So keep that in mind. And if you play solo and you want to continue playing solo, but feel like you are not having fun anymore, there always is the option, for example, to abuse consumables, blessings from shrine, or summoning stones to increase your power and make things easier. Take care and see you soon.